Hello, welcome. I'm Paul Carrigan, and I'm here with Janelle Adsit, poet and professor at Humboldt State University, to talk about her new book, Toward an Inclusive Creative Writing, Threshold Concepts to Guide the Literary Writing Conversation, out last year by Bloomsbury. Janelle, thanks for joining me for this conversation.
Well, thank you. I'm very glad to be here chatting with you today.
So your book starts with an argument about creative writing as a discipline that I think it's an argument that applies to a lot of disciplines, which is that it's something that would seem neutral, but it's not neutral. Like, the discipline as a whole is not inclusive, it's not neutral, it's biased towards a particular cultural group, specifically kind of middle class, white, male values and tastes. In ways that are not obvious to well, I guess people who are included, but may be very obvious to people who historically have been excluded. So I'm curious about your journey in coming to this realization. Did you always realize that the discipline was not including everyone, or was there a journey to wake up to this and kind of realize it? What happened to get you to be writing a book about inclusion?
Oh, that's a great question. I often say that I feel like I started writing this book the day I entered the creative writing classroom as a student. And it's funny because I occupy a lot of the subject position categories that you just named. That I'm a white person, grew up in a middle class community, and so one might think that creative writing would seem to just be in many ways naturalized in my point of view. But right away, I had this sense that this discipline is operating on all of us, myself and my peers. And really the faculty members, my wonderful teachers who were in front of the classroom facilitating our conversations. The discipline as a construct and as a historical entity operates on all of us, telling us what counts as good writing and who counts as an author. And I think I had a sense of this early on. I say in the book that I felt like I was being rolled out and reshaped, something like dough in the creative writing class, because it was clear to me that a certain set of texts and a certain set of textual values were prioritized and elevated above all others. And some of I remember being jolted when some of the books that I enjoyed and knew that my friends enjoyed were disparaged in the creative writing classroom. And it became clear to me, oh, this is a taste production machine, this discipline that I'm in and that I want to enter but also feel ambivalent about. It's interesting because I went on to teach this very discipline, and after kind of winding through rhetoric and composition and rhetorical theory and some work in affect studies as well, I ended up in a position that I'm teaching across the genres in creative writing. And so I also want to attribute much of my journey to my students' knowledge and my students' expertise and the ways that they have helped me to understand this, the ways that this discipline operates better. So they've been a key part of my journey, and I'm so grateful for the conversations we've had about pedagogy and about the discipline's values as they saw it from their vantage point.
The description shaped almost like dough. I think a lot of teachers would say, yeah, that's what we're doing. But not realize that it's not a neutral shape. There's maybe there are multiple ways you can be shaped for the better, not just kind of one predetermined aesthetic. And I think that ties in. For me, the most challenging point of your book is the idea that craft itself, kind of the heart of what I think most creative writing teachers think they're teaching, is the craft, the singular craft. And on you can see I have heavily annotated your book. On page 61, I think you say it most directly. You say craft-based instruction is fundamentally exclusionary. And then a few pages later, 72, as the alternative, you say the aesthetic inclinations that students come to the creative writing classroom with are not to be reformed, but are legitimized as one of many approaches that should be considered. No fixed set of criteria can count for all audiences. So the creative writing classroom should bring into conversation multiple aesthetics. And this is the most challenging for me because philosophically, I get it. And I say, oh, that's completely convincing that if we're just putting forward one aesthetic and this leaves so much stuff out, we don't want to do that. It's like in literature classes that if you just taught the Western canon and called it literature and you're just leaving everything out. So you're going to teach in the creative writing class how to write in a Western male, right? So I get that philosophically, but then when I turn to my classroom and I think, well, I still want to teach imagery and metaphor and complexity and characterization. So these elements that I've internalized that I value so much as the craft of writing. So I don't know if you can help me sort that out. Maybe the difference between philosophically, I get that. Then when I come back, I have a craft I want to teach. So do I just have to get over that? Do I have to learn more aesthetics myself? But help me out.
Yeah, I love that question. And it's something I grapple with regularly in my classroom because we have a fixed set of time. And no matter what, we're going to be leaving something out, of course. What I've come to in my own practice is to really foreground these questions for students, to put the question of, well, first of all, to have them read something like the Pure Craft is a Lie series by Matthew Salesses. And I'm so thankful that essay will be in print soon, a forthcoming collection, Critical Creative Writing from Bloomsbury. Now students will be able to read that in print as well as online.
That you edited.
Yeah, it's been a really exciting project, and so I think that will be a useful tool for students. But having them read things like that essay and put the questions that I'm grappling with into the air, into the space of the classroom. Recognizing that craft is the traditional creative writing notion of craft is one discourse and one lexicon that we want to give students access to, but recognizing that it's always going to come with a value system, and that power is at work in all of the conversations that we're having. So if we start with this notion that pure craft is a myth, that craft is coming from a specific tradition that has been that has given rise to a particular set of literary texts and has really centered a particular set of authors. If we keep that contextualized, we can still teach it, but a kind of comparative approach would allow us to interrogate the craft that we're also learning. And this is a hefty task for us as faculty and the students in the room. It's really adding several dimensions to creative writing. Suddenly, our students are thinking about the discipline in a critical way. They're asked to engage in metacognition and also a kind of craft criticism, if you will, as they think about, how can I contribute to the conversations that are taking place about creative writing while I'm also learning the craft of creative writing, but a more pluralistic version of it, as I'm learning the practice of being a writer. So I think about the writing about writing movement in composition and writing studies, and I think creative writing has a version of its own to take on. So what is the writing about writing for creative writing? I think it's an interrogation of the discipline as we've known it, and it's an invitation to reflect on the ideas about literature that creative writing has proffered.
I think that's fascinating. So I think an impulse might be for some people to say that if you want to question the standards of what the aesthetic craft is and be more inclusive, that this might be a softening of discipline, and that you're trading off rigor for welcome, and that this might be a good compromise or might not be, depending on someone's stance. But you're saying no. We actually have to be more rigorous. The challenge is greater than just making space for people. Not that that's not an important challenge in itself, but that when you go deeper and you don't just teach students how to write, but you teach them how to think about writing. This is a deeper, more complex, more challenging goal than just transmitting a single craft.
Yeah.
I'm thinking.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I would also say that there's a comparative dimension to this too. So, the knowledge of comparative literatures, the knowledge of comparative aesthetics. So it's the metacognitive, and then also a more pluralistic understanding of the literary landscape globally, and also within our own national context for the diversity that is held here.
I love that, and I'm thinking in literary studies with the Gerald Graff's Teach the Conflicts, and he's saying things exactly like you're saying, which is let students in on these questions, give them the craft criticism, let them know what it is we're debating, and it gives that higher level understanding of the discipline. And in rhetoric and composition studies, and the attention to rhetoric and to audience. I think at one point the quote I read from your book just a minute ago: no set of criteria fits every audience. And so if you want to teach students how to reach audiences, they need a range of choices if they're going to write for a range of audiences. My next thing I want to ask you about is, so the central case you make in the book is for the use of threshold concepts, and this is a concept. The concept of threshold concepts is that in any discipline there are certain concepts that are hard to learn, but then when students grasp them, it's transformative. It changes everything about how they understand and see the discipline. And this is a concept that you are borrowing from the larger conversation on teaching and learning in higher education. And you just talked about your journey through rhetoric and composition, which is very much a teaching-based discipline, that pedagogy and studies of how students learn are deeply embedded in that discipline. And this has not traditionally been the case for creative writing pedagogy. It's a very underdeveloped field that your book is coming in. Like a lot of professors in any discipline, we tend to teach based on lore, or we teach based on just how our teachers taught. And some disciplines are doing a much better job at being part of this larger scholarly conversation. That's not good enough to just teach the way we taught. Let's actually think rigorously through how to teach. And so how did that, tell me a little bit about that, why when facing these challenges did you turn to this broader conversation, and how did you do that to really produce scholarship on teaching creative writing versus just advice or lore or anecdote?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The idea of the threshold concept gripped me when I first heard of it, because the way that it was presented to me was this idea that when we're pressed up against our lenses, we don't see the frame. but when the threshold concept enables us to take the lens and give ourselves some distance from it and then see it for what it is. So the threshold concept is a way of naming things that we are implicitly often trying to teach students as we help them to gain entrance into this discipline. So that's the threshold idea, gaining entrance. And also threshold for its liminality was attractive to me as well. So I appreciated the threshold concept because it held complexity as a value, but also because it was a way of really putting our hands around the clay, if you will, if we can switch the metaphor a bit. If we are in and of the clay of our discipline, it's a way of kind of taking that which we are in and of and putting our hands around it so that we can remold it. And that's a metaphor I've come to since working with threshold concepts in my own scholarship. So that was attractive to me. And I knew that creative writing, like any discipline, already had threshold concepts at work. One might be that writers learn craft, and craft is the timeless, universal set of concerns that writers use to approach and shape literature. So I knew that those were already operating, and I wanted to kind of identify them, though I don't list them out in the book. I approach the state of the field in a more fluid way, perhaps. But then the threshold concepts that I do offer as new threshold concepts for the field, or I want to be sure to underscore that I see my book as not starting a conversation, but just contributing to one that pre-exists me and has been concurrent with the field from the beginning. But the threshold concepts that I offered are meant to change the dominant discourses of the field. And I think that they are useful because they're not set in stone, they're troublesome, they have a kind of dynamism to them that enables us to make sure the conversation continues. So it's not that these are fixed and unmoving and unchanging. The threshold concept, by its very nature, has some fluidity and is a place of it's kind of a contact zone, if you will. It's a place of movement and discussion. So that was part of why I thought it could be a useful tool for the project that I had in mind.
So most creative writers, including those who teach in universities, don't think as much about teaching as they think about their own writing, and aren't part of this broader, larger conversation on pedagogy in higher education. What drew you not just to threshold concepts specifically, but to doing scholarship on teaching? How did that come about?
Yeah, throughout my career, coming up through graduate work and such, I've always been drawn to scholarship of teaching and learning. I've always envisioned myself at a teaching university. Teaching has been centered in my own career. And I just saw in my graduate level work what a giant gap there was. So I was someone who straddled the rhetoric and composition and creative writing divides, as we've talked about already. And I saw the proliferating scholarship in rhetoric and composition about the classroom. I mean, books and books and books published on this topic. And there wasn't a parallel in creative writing. Certainly there was work being done in creative writing. Wendy Bishop, Stephanie Vanderslice, many, Graham Harper, many people actively engaged in the conversation, but not at all to the scale of rhetoric and composition. And I wondered about that. What institutional forces are making it that way? When they're both writing studies, they're neighboring intradisciplines. The creative writer is likely to have an office right next door to the rhetoric and composition person on the faculty. why is it that they are not talking to each other really? I mean, with the exception of some major crossover figures like Wendy Bishop or Doug Hesse or a number of others. Why are the fields kind of separate? And why is it that they are not keeping pace with each other in terms of scholarly production about teaching? I also see creative writing as just a fascinating site of pedagogical production, because it's bringing together literary studies and theories of writing every day in the classroom. We're teaching students to be cultural producers. They are the ones who will go on to perhaps, depending on the orientation of their creative writing program, be in the writer's room, in filmmaking or television shows. They are the ones who are making decisions about how a particular character will be portrayed. When we say representation matters, they may be the ones making decisions about representation, whether in literary texts, or they might transfer their skills to other media. And I think that's a growing area in creative writing right now. It's thinking about how the work that we do in the creative writing classroom does transfer across genres and modes. So it's just such an important site of pedagogy. Our students will go on to shape the world, and that attracted me. So the gap in the knowledge, plus the tremendous opportunity that I see the classroom, the creative writing classroom in particular, to be.
Oh, I love both of those. I've noticed in literary studies that the same exact gap relative to composition studies. It makes me a little jealous. I look over there and see all the good stuff they have teaching. I have a couple more questions for you, but I wondered, do you have any questions for me as a reader of your book?
Oh, I love that question. I wonder what you imagine for the next stages of the conversation. Where do you imagine the conversation going next? And if you were to write a response to a book-length response, what kind of research would you take on?
Oh, I like that. That's good. Okay, so I have. Well, I think I was on your website just before this, and I saw that you're working on a textbook.
I am, yeah.
So that was my first thought when I finished reading this book is Janelle needs to write a textbook because I think so many textbooks, creative writing textbooks are, well, I mean, they embody precisely this craft-based approach that you critique. And so I thought, well, we need a textbook that is built around these threshold concepts. So I think that's the next step, and I am eagerly awaiting when you publish those textbooks. If I were going to write book-length response to this, oh, I love that question. Maybe I'll have to go and write a book-length response to answer it. Right? How do you know what you're going to say until you've said it?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think the next, well, maybe not a book-length response, but maybe an essay. So to complicate the challenging of craft, the traditional craft concepts being associated with kind of a white male kind of Western perspective. In the abstract, as I said already, that I get that, and that's persuasive to me. But then when I turn to kind of the contemporary American writers of color and women writers and writers that fall outside of those categories, I see them using the same techniques to great effect. Toni Morrison, Gloria Anzaldúa, who you cite as an example. I think she's included in your craft criticism essay, right?
Or the textbook. Yeah.
or your collection of craft criticism.
Yeah, exactly.
And so she's certainly broadening the techniques, but she's still using imagery and narrative and characterization and metaphor. So I guess I would be curious in developing for myself a more complex view. It's not just that these tools belong, right? The famous, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools, but maybe you can. So I don't know. I guess I'd be curious, and I don't know if I'm being very articulate. I'm thinking on the spot here. In complicating, seeing the kind of the writers of color and women writers and writers of other diverse categories using the traditional techniques. I might want to look into that more.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a really important point, that imagery in and of itself is not associated with white male values. It's how imagery is taught. So I think craft, it's the myth of pure craft. So that when we mobilize craft, that we're just mobilizing a set of formal concerns. What I think we're actually doing is mobilizing a set of values. And that's what chapter 2 is about. So I think we are offering a set of taste-making principles about, no excessive emotion and, those points. Imagery or metaphor or, the number of other words that we use to describe text, I think are mobile. But when we deploy them in the creative writing class, we have behind them a framework that is valuing a certain set of texts. And that's why we tend to teach, if you look at and I haven't done the numbers on this, it's a research project I want to take on, but you get the sense that there's a canon of texts that creative writing teaches that are repeated again and again in the craft texts that we see. And they often offer up those values associated maybe with minimalism, of, show, don't tell, and you don't want sentimentality, you don't want melodrama. Those ideas, sentimentality and melodrama, are loaded, and they they can easily disparage certain aesthetic traditions. Though they seem like neutral terms, like, oh yes, this is objectively sentimental, they are very culturally specific. And so that's what I really want to dismantle. It's not that we should stop naming imagery as imagery, but we should recognize that there is more behind how we teach imagery, and that there are risks and possibilities in how a text's use of imagery will affect its diverse readers. So that was the shift I'm going to make. But I love the essay that you have in mind. Working out that kind of nexus, I think, is a really important next step. What does it mean to still teach the language of creative writing while pluralizing the aesthetic values that come behind it?
Yeah, maybe we should write that.
Oh, the conversation continues. There are so many people who are contributing here.
Okay, I have two questions left that I guess you maybe can give concise answers to. Can you give us an example of a key change you've made in your teaching through writing the book? So before you wrote the book, you did one thing, and now you do something else. And then also, what is something now after the book that you're still wrestling with?
Oh, great. Since writing the book, I have changed the order in which I teach certain things. So I used to save, if I were to talk about things that, if I were to talk about those thorny issues of creative writing, like cultural appropriation, the pigeonholing of writers of color in particular, but minoritized writers, the questions surrounding linguistic diversity and representation. Those issues I used to wait for until they came up in workshop. And then I would try to, scaffold the conversation and kind of move the conversation in a different direction. I now put those at the front of the class. I put them in the first weeks so that we get a working vocabulary and comfort with talking about these issues of power in the classroom collectively. So the first weeks of class are about, what assumptions are we coming with about authorship? What assumptions are we coming with about the ethical choices that we make every time we sit down to write? What is cultural appropriation? Kind of anticipating some of the things that might come up in workshop. And I find that it changes the stories or the poems that students will actually bring. So the problematic text that clearly is appropriating cultural traditions with little respect for them, I don't see that as much, or if ever, because we've talked about it at the beginning of the semester, really before they've written full stories. So that's been the major shift that I've made. And that's been at the prompting of one student in particular, Mirabai Collins, who's in the acknowledgement section. She and I had a really important conversation in my life that made me realize, oh, I'm doing this in a way that is stressful for everybody by waiting for the issues to arise, and they're already there. They're always already there. So that's been a big change. And then your second question, I'm forgetting.
Yeah. What now are you still wrestling with after having written the book?
Yeah, I'm still wrestling with how to really help creative writing programs in my own program to thoroughly dismantle the white-centered nature of the work that we do, and there are a number of ways that power works that we need to be mindful of. But I really am thinking in an intersectional way about race in the classroom, and I want to say that it is. I've come to the conclusion that it really is in every decision that we make as educators. It is in the decisions we make about who to bring to campus as visiting writers. It's about what we put up on the walls, how we advertise our own programs, how we narrate our own programs, how we recruit and retain faculty and students, and make a deliberate effort at that, making sure that a diverse body and community, a diverse community of writers are in the room, in every room. So that is something that I think the field needs to be thinking about, I need to be thinking about, and that really comes with an interrogation of my own privilege and my own assumptions and my own white racial lens and cultural identity. So it's external work in all that we do, and it's internal work as well, and that constant interplay. So I see that as a lifelong project for myself.
Well, Janelle, I have so thoroughly enjoyed talking with you, and I'm looking forward to all of the things that you write on this coming in the years ahead. Thank you so much. Is there any last words you'd like to say?
Oh, I just want to underscore my thanks. I really appreciate you taking the time this morning to chat about the book, and thank you for reading it.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
We'll chat again soon, I hope.
I do as well.